I just want to start off by reading the dust cover on the back of the book. John B. Alexander, Ph.D., is a retired senior Army officer with decades of experience with a wide range of phenomena. Traveling to all 8 continents, he's encountered events that defy common explanation. He has met with shamans in the Amazon, the Himalayas, the Andes, East and West Africa, and northern Mongolia, and it goes on from there. And I went to your site, johnbalexander.com, and you are all over the place. You're just one of the most amazing people I've ever seen in my entire life. I thought I was worldly, but you really are a Renaissance man.
Thank you.
And your books are terrific. You have UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies, and Realities, and then the latest one is Reality Denied.
Correct.
And as I'm going through the book, I don't even know where to start. You're covering a little bit of, I guess, mentalist stuff where they're bending steel, out-of-body experiences, near-death experience, remote viewing, and, of course, the UFO topic is part of this whole thing. So why don't you tell us what the most popular subject, when you interact with people, what's the main topic that people want to talk to you about?
I couldn't even begin to address that. 2 major ones. One's UFOs. Another one probably would be near-death experiences or post-mortem communication.
Yeah.
And the reason is that so many people have had experiences, far more than most realize. I mean, we guess that probably 10% of the population have seen what they believe to be a UFO. And similarly, you have probably 8% of the adult population, meaning over 18, who have had NDEs or, spontaneous events of some kind. Not to mention that everybody has anomalous events. Many people don't acknowledge that, but, simple things like precognition, so what's going to happen and that sort of thing.
Yeah, or intuition. And I could give you an example of that. When my daughter was really sick, she was about 4 or 5 years old, and my wife didn't know what was bothering her. She gets to the door of the bathroom, and she doesn't even make the toilet. She urinates right there. And as my wife is asking what's wrong with my daughter, the voice of my mom, who passed away a couple years earlier, is clear as day. She's got pneumonia in my mom's voice. And I tell my wife, I go, my mom says, I heard her voice as plain as day. She's got pneumonia. We take her to the doctor. She has pneumonia. So these things do happen. Premonition and, the intuition. You got that feeling. Do you think when it comes to the near-death experience or this out-of-body experience, is it more of a physical relationship with the chemical reactions that are going on in the brain, or is something really happening?
Well, now you've asked about 5 questions there, actually. Well, the short answer is something else. I do not think it's purely chemical. Now, the central issue there is brain and mind and duality. And, conventional wisdom says mind as we know it is located in the brain, which is physical. In many of the areas that I talk in are what we call non-local mind, which says that basically everything is out there and accessible. Let me give you an example. The one that you just gave is excellent. In other words, your mother talking very clearly, giving cogent information that was critically needed at that moment. And that would be an example of what we call post-mortem communication. Now, there are mediums and people who do this routinely, and yet there's also quite a few just average people. There used to be something known as the widow's syndrome, and it came from the time when women traditionally outlived men, and found that about a third of them, after husbands had died, and it's not just male-female sort of thing, but would have some sort of communication, and that ranged from the kinds of things you described. Mother's voice is there, sensing of the person being around, up to and including that individual walking in and, being physically present at the time.
Well, I do remember one time, I don't think my wife and my mother got along all that well, and after she died, it turns out she was murdered, and there's a story that goes along with that you'll probably find interesting. My dad gave her what he thought was my mother's ring, and my wife put it on, and one day, my wife feels a push down the stairs, and she falls down, and as she hits the bottom, the ring pops off. And so to this day, she says that my mother pushed her down the stairs because she didn't want her wearing that ring, which didn't belong to her in the first place.
Quite possible, but that's in the really, you cannot determine that. But it's certainly not an isolated kind of incident. There are a number of those. Hopefully the majority of them are beneficial, such as the one with, providing information about your daughter.
Well, I'm very fascinated by what you're talking about because I'm also an Orthodox priest. And if you've ever been into an Orthodox church, which I think you have because I saw some photos on your site where there's an Orthodox cross and you're going into the chapel, you'll notice that there's all these things we call icons, which are pictures of saints or the picture of Jesus or Mary, the Mother of God. And, as Orthodox Christians or as Roman Catholics, there's this attachment towards saints, and we have patron saints. And, some people have these mystical experiences with these beings. I know as a matter of faith it happens, but you as more of a scientific person with your type of background, what would you say is going on?
I think one of the biggest problems we have in the West is a restrictive belief system based on materialism. And unfortunately, most of the scientific community, just as you describe these sorts of events, say it can't be, therefore it isn't, there must be some other explanation. As you noted, I have traveled all over the world. And what I find in other sectors, and I'd like to use Brazil as a specific example, but in most of the world, there's an acknowledgement of the spirit world. In the West, if we do that, we look at the spirit world and the real world, the one that we're talking in right now, as if they're separate and distinct. When I deal with shamans all over the world, sometimes you have to find out, say, no, wait a minute, are you talking about a spirit entity or world versus here? And the point is, they move seamlessly back and forth and are willing to accept it. If I might use Brazil as an example, I do work down there periodically. I deal with very, very high-level people, and most of this has to do with national, international security, weapons work, and things of that nature. The people that I'm dealing with are, senior officers, generals, admirals, government ministers, and people like that. Point is, they are very highly educated, mostly in educational systems based on, Western systems, and yet they culturally accept spiritism and the spirits, and they can integrate those things very well, whereas our scientists, if you will, tend not to accept those things, even when some of them have had their own personal experiences.
Well, I noticed you cover that in your book, Reality Denied, in Chapter 20, the whole thing about spirits of Brazil. And then you mentioned Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, who is depicted in on Netflix. And I'm like, it's like watching a train wreck. You just can't stop watching the whole series. In regard to some of the things that you're discussing and how in the West there is this like divide between the spiritual and what we call reality, you're right about that. And I think many Orthodox Christians in particular, because they're Eastern Rite, so to speak, are more in tune to the mysticism of the faith. Now, there was another point that I was thinking, and then when we look in the history of civilization, we look at ancient people as somehow not as smart as we are. But it turns out when you do your research, they were more advanced on so many different levels. You want to talk about that?
Oh, where to begin? Well, there are several issues to unpack there. One is obviously they have a closer connection to nature and more accepting of various phenomena. Healing, I think, is a great example. Let me talk about Africa for a moment. In the U.S., we have several, number of doctors per 1,000 people in the country. When you're in Africa, you run into areas where you have one healthcare practitioner, not necessarily a doctor, for 10,000 people. The point is that they need alternatives, and so many of these medical practices that have come forth are just based on necessity. One of the things, if you're tracking YouTube and that, you will find that there are experiences of them doing brain surgery in thousands of years ago in cases where an individual survived, and we know that because of the brain growth that took place after open cranial surgery. And you go, how in the world did those societies be able to do neurosurgery and survive without the understanding that we now have with fMRIs, where you can actually watch the functioning of the brain. So is that some of what you're discussing?
Oh, yeah, that's really interesting stuff. I want to go deeper into this because you're a world traveler. On Chapter 22 of Reality Denied, you talk about your trip to Mongolia. Mm. You give us an explanation of what the terrain is like and how many people are there. And then I read this interesting thing about Genghis Khan. He's got 35 million descendants or direct descendants.
Right.
How did he find time to do all of that? I'm just kidding.
Well, hey, it started a long time ago. And, there is something about rape, pillage, and burn that as they conquered it, one of the things he did was sire a lot of progeny, and they have gone out. It is very, very prevalent in the area. He's still revered along with some of the more notable descendants. But this is what conquerors did. And obviously impregnated a lot of people, and then it spread exponentially.
Well, yes, I mean you're exactement on that. Back to this though, this whole Genghis Khan character and the people of Mongolia. I remember watching John Wayne as Genghis Khan. I thought that was a really bad job. I'm like, no. I just don't. I don't agree with how he's being depicted in this movie. But much like Africa, you talk in your book how the population might be, I think you were saying something like 3 million. Am I right about that? I don't know how many people, but it's a huge area. It's the size of...
In Mongolia? Yeah. No, that is the least densely populated country in the world. It's 3 times the size of France. And yet has a population of about 3 million, of which half of them live in Ulaanbaatar, the capital itself. Now, you also remember the topography varies greatly because you have, and we were right up on the mountains in the Siberian border, great forested areas. We talk about traveling over glaciers and whatnot, getting in there. To the south, you have the Gobi Desert, which is almost totally unpopulated. But it's a phenomenal country. I'd highly recommend it to people that want to go. Now, we went, I think it was August, September, and by October of the year, we're far enough north, you cannot even get into these areas. What you didn't mention is travel I gained great respect for Toyota Land Cruisers, which is what we're using. We had flown to Maroom, which is about 2 to 3 hours west of Ulaanbaatar. Got a car, and there was a paved road, and we started north for about an hour. All of a sudden, they turned left, and it was like driving through the Rockies without a road. We didn't even see a gravel road for another couple of weeks. And when we had traveled as far as you could go there, then we had to go by horseback in. So these are really, really remote areas, and they still exist. Of course, what we were doing was, as the book indicates, and we talk about the shamans there, and again, a lot of this has evolved because of minimal contact with the outside world. Although some, it was one of the things the Chinese have done.
Well, I was reading somewhere that long ago, a Roman legion got lost in somewhere in Mongolia or China. And to this day, you have people that look Chinese but are blue-eyed and have blonde hair. Do you know anything about the lost Roman legion?
No, that one I am not familiar with. But legions did get lost in a few areas. I know there are some in Africa that went out and just totally disappeared.
See, that's kind of cool stuff when you think about it.
Yeah.
Or if you get to the modern times, during the Vietnam War, we've always heard stories about soldiers from the United States disappearing into the country, and they might be alive to this day, just living in Vietnam.
Well, in my example, people might not know, I was a Special Forces, a Green Beret commander up on the Cambodian border, but down in the Delta. And there were reports periodically of round eyes, as they call them, who were traveling with the VC. And these were not folks who had been captured. Some of them may have been back the days when the French were fighting there. But you have ethnic splits in many areas of the world.
I find that so interesting. Now, let's move over to some other things that are part of your book, like remote viewing and psychic spies. It seems like a lot of people are interested in that. I know I am. How does remote viewing work?
25 words or less.
As long as it takes.
Yeah. No, the easiest answer is I don't know. And there are a number of models that have been set up. The early ones thought it was some sort of electromagnetic frequency that we don't understand. Basically, so the people are knowing, what happens is you have an individual who is in a room, and from the spying, they're given a target, and they go out and make a mental connection with it. Now, the problem comes in when you start perturbating time, meaning that you're doing precognitive and retrocognitive remote viewing, and don't know how to do that. There's an example that I use from Princeton in the book, and this is one in which an individual was going to be traveling to what was then Czechoslovakia, and the remote viewers were given the task of finding out what that person was going to be observing. And the point was the target had not even been selected, let alone viewed, at the time that the individual, a day later, went and selected the target and whatnot. So how is it that one can, provide accurate information about a site when that site hasn't even been selected? I want to put a cautionary note, and I get in trouble with the remote viewing community here. And my point is, sometimes it works. This is not like 100%, although you'll hear some ridiculous claims like that. But sometimes accurate data are generated, and that's the key issue. there's a signal-to-noise problem. One we don't understand is why is it accurate sometimes and not others?
Well, I would say, Colonel, that there's probably economic reasons why somebody might get on the radio and say it works 100% of the time. Take my course. That probably has something to do with it.
Yeah, well, that is correct. And what I say for folks that are out there, there are very few that I personally recommend. And the main thing is caveat emptor.
Yes. I believe in caveat emptor and de gustibus non est disputandum. Taste is not to be argued. I really like your book, Reality Denied. And on chapter 11, you start going through the out-of-body experiences. I have not read the entire book. I'm engrossed in it. I'm taking my time, and I flipped around, and it's so much fun. I intend to take this when I'm on my flight to Germany in May. I'm going to read this while on the airplane. It'll probably freak people out, and I'll just tell everybody I'm the pilot. I'm remote flying. But seriously, have you ever yourself had an out-of-body experience?
No, actually. Well, very minor. And I say partial, and I was working with sensory deprivation at the time, and had some very unusual experiences. Are you familiar with sensory deprivation tanks?
Yes, I'm familiar with that. I'm also familiar with being a parent of a newborn at one time, so you get deprived of sleep, and you start seeing things.
Yeah. So anyway, I was in a tank and had that. Having said that, my brother in particular had one, and this was associated with being very ill at the time, but not a classic NDE. No, if I can differentiate between being physically close to death and just really ill and separating from one's body. These happen spontaneously, often under stress. There are techniques that people can use to train to do that, and some are successful and some not. One of the things we don't understand in kind of all of these areas is what I just mentioned. Why is it that some people have these experiences and others don't? And that's particularly true, I might add, when you get into the healing, spontaneous healing sorts of things. Mm-hmm. Why do some people get healed and others not, given the same set of circumstances?
Well, I would just say that's part of the miracle of life. And if you are a person of faith, you know exactly why you were healed. And maybe you don't know why you're not healed. I mean, it's just one of those things. Let's move on to UFOs and some other secret stuff that's going on throughout the world. I don't know if you're how much you know about this, but I've been hearing a lot about Antarctica. What's going on down there? It's
cold. Actually, it's warming up. It's getting close to summer area.
Right.
I do not put any faith in the notion of UFOs in Antarctica on that. Having said that, from a pragmatic standpoint, for anybody who can go, it is a phenomenal trip. The amount of wildlife will surprise you considerably. But as for underground bases and things of that nature, I read that literature, and I put it in, okay, if you believe. But
okay. Fair enough. And if anybody's tuning in right now, the legend is, the myth, if you want to call it that, the Nazis never were defeated in World War II. They have secret underground bases in Antarctica. And leaders from all around the world over the past few years have been going there, like John Kerry, the one-time Secretary of State. Patriarch Kirill of Moscow was there. Former President Obama, I think, did a trip to Antarctica. Honestly, Colonel, I'd like to go to Antarctica myself for the reasons that you stated, to see the glaciers and the penguins and the whales and the various other wildlife.
It is fantastic. And sailing, even on some substantial cruise ships, it's one thing. You're on maybe the 10th or 12th deck looking up at the iceberg, and then say, and 90% of this is below.
Yeah. And the proverbial tip of the iceberg is for real.
Yeah,
let's
highly recommended.
Let's talk more about UFOs. I mean, you have a book called UFO Myths, Conspiracies, and Realities. And any person that's, I guess, sort of interested in UFOs or knows the story by watching the History Channel or listening to the radio, we all hear about Roswell. Can you tell us what happened?
Well, this is where I get into lots of trouble.
Oh, I'm a troublemaker, so go for it.
But, I come down against. There was an event that happened. In my view, it was ours. Now,
Right.
I have some friends who I highly respect who say no, that it was, in fact, a crash that took place. What I say in the book is that I think it was an event that what you have to remember is the time. We're talking 1947. We have a nuclear weapon. The Soviet Union does not, but we know that they're working on it. And in short, I think what we had was a sensor system that was being developed that would tell us when they popped their first nuke. Because from a geostrategic standpoint, that changes the equation dramatically. And it's a little complex. It is explained there, but what we needed was a system that took a lot of metal, very fine metal, up into the air, very high altitude. Contrary to popular belief, the materials that are described from Roswell did exist at that time, meaning they had things that you could deform and called metal with a memory would return to the original configuration. That was important because of winds in the upper atmosphere at 60 to 80,000 feet are severe and would deform this thing that was going up. It was impervious to heat, extraordinarily light, and all of that. I also point out that Jesse Marcel Jr., who was the son of Jesse Marcel, who was the major who supposedly picked up the material, he and another individual that we believe did have their hands on it were presented with a series of thin film material, and each one of them went over and said, "This is what I saw," or like it, and it definitely did exist at the time.
Okay, and there could have been a disinformation campaign going on for whatever reason?
Oh, for whatever, as you know, my second career was Los Alamos National Laboratory, and during that time frame, they were doing a lot of truth and reconciliation, where people were admitting to experiments that was done, and I knew a number of the scientists and watched their interviews. Every one of them started the interview by saying it was a different time. And one of the problems now for people who weren't old enough to live it and actually understand what was going on, do not understand the Soviet threat at that time. You know, going to school, we did learning duck and cover, thinking that an attack might be imminent. The beginning of the Cold War was, a very, very different time and almost hard to imagine by folks today, particularly young folks today, cannot envision that world.
We're speaking with John B. Alexander, a retired colonel, Ph.D., the author of Reality Denied. You were talking about the Cold War. Colonel, how close were we to World War III?
Well, at times it got pretty squeaky. Certainly the Cuban Missile Crisis was one. One of the concerns, of course, was miscalculation on the parts. Having said that, we also had situations where we had a lot of surrogate wars. In fact, I talk about World War X in some of my other books, and the reason is I can't count. Because what is actually, the global conflict? Because between us and various communist nations, Southeast Asia is one area. Africa, there were wars going on there.
Proxy wars.
Yeah, hot wars. But an interesting example would be a place that's under stress now in Ethiopia and Sudan and places like that, where it was interesting because there was a time in which we supported the countries to the south, and while the Soviets were supporting the ones to the north, and then we literally switched sides. And we started supporting certain Ethiopian forces on that. And it's one of the reasons that the area to this day is just awash in weapons. And the actual confrontation, of course, was, more U.S. and Soviet. And unfortunately, millions of people were caught in the middle.
Are we back at square one, Russia against the United States in proxy wars, and maybe China is involved in that as well?
Oh, you want to go geopolitical? Okay.
Well, because I just see a pattern developing here, and it seems like we never learn our lesson, and I see some of the same things creeping up again, and you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure it out.
Well, it's, I think, very different. The Soviets, or the Russians, I keep switching back to the battle, they do not have the capacity. They have a capacity to be a huge nuisance, but would be obliterated in direct conflict. I recently, in the last 2 months, returned from China, and I think that we have grossly miscalculated, not from a military standpoint, but the economic growth that's going on there. We have, the infrastructure and things. I was there 10 years ago, and then recently. The advances that are being made are just phenomenal. The joke is that the national bird is the crane.
It's funny.
Yeah, we visited little cities of 9 million people I'd never heard of. What's being done in roads and development. The other thing is that they have a strategic view of the world, where ours is terribly myopic and even worse under the current administration, and wants to do America first, meaning America only. As I've traveled throughout Africa, and this has been true for 10, 15 years, have bumped into the Chinese everywhere. And they're not just there, but they are with engineers and medical assistants. And again, the strategic view, what they've done, they're going to need food. And going into Africa, and the problem in Africa is that the population across the board is doubling about every 20 years. And there's a question if they haven't already crossed the level of sustainability for the entire continent. But, putting in infrastructure, roads, resources, in South Sudan, for instance, building roads and pipelines, and the pipelines go out towards to the sea, and the point is to move oil, because with an emerging population, their energy requirements are going up. But they are making tremendous advances in that. Another thing that to watch is the advances in science and education. Have a friend who was very senior scientist and had been with CIA, the head of life sciences for a while, and he had spent several years actually in China with the Chinese Academy of Sciences. The particular area was in fMRIs, monitoring of the brain. And the reason for being there is that they were probably on par with anything being done in this country. And that's a while back. And they have, as I say, have a strategic view. Current controversy, of course, in the South China Sea, with them building islands out there. I frankly thought it was a rather innovative approach, but we're looking at it as freedom of the sea. And one of the issues is the territorial territorial waters that they claim, and interactions between there and Indonesia and the Philippines and Vietnam, etc.
So your analysis...
I don't think we're going to fight them.
I would say that we'll most likely not fight them, but
well,
you never know.
The point is, you don't. You say, why not? You don't shoot your best customer, which is us. And remember, Walmart in particular has, the amount of trade that is done with them exceeds trade between the U.S. and most countries, and that's just one company.
And we enjoy our cheap crap, so we don't want that to go away. We want to be able to have our iPhones and things like that.
Oh yes,
yeah,
and they can do it, but China is going to challenge economically, and they are rising very fast. There's a few concerns as to, but their middle class, for instance, has expanded greatly. And there are certain things, advantages to a directed economy, which they have done, and they don't always play fair in international trade, but I think that can be worked out. But they are playing the Pacific Rim. When we withdrew from the TPP, remember, China saw that as a great advantage, and we tend to forget that all of the west coast of South America is on the Pacific and part of that trading partnership.
Well, one of these days we'll have to talk about some strategies that we might consider here in the United States. Let's move over to space for a second. You bring up China. I know that they're exploring the moon right now. We were supposed to go back. Do you have any idea why we haven't gone back to the moon? And also, while we're on the subject, I really get annoyed when people say that the whole space exploration and our NASA program and Apollo program to the moon was faked.
Well, that's nonsense. Yeah,
I get really, I find it offensive.
As you know, I am personal friends with several of the Apollo astronauts. As Edgar Mitchell used to say, "Gee, I thought I was there." No, that definitely went. Part of it is cost. What folks don't realize is that during the time of the Apollo moon project, that we were spending about 4% of the national budget on space exploration. Right now, that's down to about 0.4%.
That's ridiculous. That's horrible.
Money is not there. I think we have ceded it to
private industry.
To China is reaching out. Now, having said that, you may know that I worked here for Bob Bigelow, who owns Bigelow Aerospace. And if you look at the work of Elon Musk and Bezos and all of them, what you're seeing is a tendency towards civilianization of the effort. Now, Burt Rutan is a friend of mine. If you don't know aerospace, he's kind of legendary. But one of the things he did, and I had the privilege to be there at the Mojave Space Flight Center when he put Mike Melville into space. And the point was that was the first effort. It was supported by George Allen to put a civilian into space using totally civilian resources. And the point was that in order to do that, he had built Spaceship One. Spaceship Two is now out, and I see that Branson has talked about, by Christmas taking civilians up as tourists. But what they did is we're moving towards civilization of space, and you see these private companies that are, frankly, accelerating. Musk has talked about Mars missions, and you probably do Moon as an intermediary. The guy I worked for here for a while when NIDS, National Institute for Discovery Science, was operating, has Bigelow Aerospace. And what they're working on is habitats that can be occupied. Now, there's a lot of reason for doing that other than just tourism. There's many things you can do from an engineering perspective in a microgravitic environment. But having watched this over a few years, I can say they have been moving at lightning speed compared to, say, NASA. Although they now have some NASA contracts. When Bert was doing his, he built Spaceship One, the White Knight, which was a plane to lift it up because you want to launch from being in space, 2 independent rocket designs and the command and control structure, and did that all for $25 million or less. Nice. And the point was NASA couldn't do the paperwork for $25 million.
That is true. It's a behemoth of a bureaucracy. But I think we could always take more of our money that we have in our pots and give it to NASA so that we can further space exploration. If people don't think it's important, then I guess they can just give up their smartphones and stop driving around using navigation systems in their cars, things like that, right?
Well, there are a host of derivatives from, Tang to space blankets to all sorts of things that have directly impacted your life. And you're exactly right on, like the navigational systems. We have, entire galaxies of satellites that are up there that, coordinate these sorts of ventures.
That's right. And not to mention the fact, I understand that there's helium-3 on the moon, which if we brought it back in canisters, would really give us a lot of energy that we could use throughout the country and throughout the world, really. Is there any truth to that, or am I just repeating some sort of fairy tale?
That's not one I would likely go along with. I do think there are efforts that have been done, such as in zero-point energy and whatnot, that bear watching. And certainly renewables ought to be at the top of our list just to save the planet so we have some place for the youngsters to live in. But one of the big issues, of course, is battery technology. There are things that can be done, but storage of energy has been a critical issue. Mm-hmm. And the long pole intent often is storage and batteries, but there are tremendous advances that are being made there as well.
Yeah, the technology's come a long way, and we have issues that require renewable sources of energy and resources. I don't want to talk about the plastics in the oceans right now or Fukushima water, but what I'd like to direct, since we're on the subject of space, a lot of people claim that they've seen UFOs. Some of the astronauts seem that they've extraterrestrial flying craft or whatever it might be.
Yep.
There's a couple things that run through my mind. It could be interdimensional beings. It could be demons. It could be actual aliens from other parts of the solar system or the galaxy, I guess I should say, or the universe. Mm-hmm. And it could be something that we're opening up portals because of some of the experiments that we try here on Earth, whether it's CERN or atom smashers, any of those kind of things. And these are kind of what crafts a lot of sci-fi genre, movies and books. So can you comment on those things? I know it's a lot, but...
Well, yeah.
Synopsis.
Quite simply, I come down against the ETH, or what's known as the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and the reason is it's just too simple and does not explain all of the data. Now, what I think you're aware of here, and you've alluded to some of the possibilities, and that is that we have had reports of interactions between humans and sentient non-human beings throughout the entirety of human history in every culture. And that they happen to fly in little tin cans is a relatively new wrinkle to that. Having said that, UFOs themselves have been seen literally for millennia as well. The first line of my UFO books is UFOs are real, and I mean that in the most literal sense of physical entities that fly around. And the last paragraph goes, whatever this is more complex than we can imagine, and possibly that we can imagine. I don't think we're at the level of, asking the right questions, much less getting simple answers. But again, to the interaction issue, has been just going on forever. And one of the problems with what I call the extraterrestrial is there are too many different variations. And unless Earth is on the galactic bucket list of places you must visit, it just doesn't make a lot of sense why you have these tremendous variations unless consciousness is a key component. And one of my mantras now is in looking at this whole panoply of phenomena is that there are connections, and in my view it is human consciousness, or the consciousness that we are a part of, that is the direction we should be looking.
I would say, and this is just my opinion, being a theologian, I rarely ever will make statements like this, but I go by what's called the teleological argument. Everything is just so in order for us to exist. And when you talk about UFOs or things that can't be explained, there's so many demons and there's so many different angels and so many saints that I could see where what you're saying is you never get the same story twice. So it's probably something on that level, metaphysical level, a mysterious level that we'll never really as human beings be able to figure out. We'll find out one day when we, go on to our next life. That would be my answer to all of that.
Well, I will mention something we haven't discussed in near death. In my view, the continuation of consciousness beyond bodily life or death is just, the evidence is overwhelming in favor. And we're talking about physical evidence that consciousness continues. What intrigues me is why, on one hand, we're willing to spend $17 billion on the Large Hadron Collider to find, the Higgs boson, or
the God particle. Yeah.
And on the other side, when you get into studying consciousness or continuation of consciousness, what ought to be of interest to 100% of the population, because you're going to get a chance to check it out, we do almost no research in that.
Well, I would say it's not research in the normal circumstances. I would say I spend a lot of time on that kind of stuff. And it's thought, and it's meditation, and it's prayer, and the activities for myself, for the life of the church. I'm not doing this stuff because I sort of believe it. No, I really do believe it. I have full faith in it. I mean, you got to be insane if you don't believe this stuff to go out and do what I do sometimes. Having said all of those things and gone over a variety of topics, what would you say is the thing that really annoys you the most when in your world, when people get on the radio and they start talking about various subjects? Because you've covered so many different subjects. What is your biggest pet peeve?
Probably these people who come down with simple answers to complex problems and absolutely sure that they have the single answer. It's also one of my, agendas, if you will, is trying to make it permissible for, best and brightest in scientists to operate and, do research in these areas without risking their livelihood and career. And the problem is too many of them, will get cut off. You find a number who have interests, but they'll tell you privately, yeah, that's interesting, I'd like to do it, but don't mention my name.
Right.
And we really, the problems are at least as complex as cancer. And we really need to engage the best and brightest minds and be doing that on a conscious level and be able to support them without having them relegated to the pile.
When you don't go along with the rest of the herd, they really get mad at you. Like doctors who are anti-vaccines, who think vaccines do more damage than good. we can't even talk about that intelligently without having somebody being threatened or, made to look like they're idiots or their licenses taken away from them. And then you don't have to go too far to find malfeasance on certain government agencies, whether it's the CDC or the FDA and all of these agencies designed to protect us. God knows what they're up to,
Well, you must remember in UFO book, there's a whole chapter on how the government works. And the point there is these are very, very large institutions, and they are manned literally by millions of people who come with a large variety of belief systems. And one of the things I note is there's a tremendous difference between institutional responsibility and individual interest. And so that's why some of these small projects get going, and also at times get killed. But institutions exist to serve themselves first and foremost, and the golden rule applies, and that is, he who has the gold makes the rules.
Oh yeah, that's the truth about that. You're not wrong. You worked at Los Alamos, and you were doing all kinds of, I guess, different projects over the years. I've often heard it said that the technology that we see that's being deployed by the military is about 50 years behind. Do you give us an idea of how far advanced we really are in relation to what we think we are?
Yeah, well, I would not agree with that. I mean, that's been, I've seen that quote quite popular. Actually, a better example, my last job in the military, I was the director of advanced system concepts for what was then the laboratory command. So I was dealing with these advanced technologies. One of the things that you mentioned bugs me, I had all of the tactical directed energy, which include lasers and high-powered microwaves and all of that. And I keep seeing these briefings coming out. And I remember about a decade ago, I was at Special Operations Command and had a briefing from their chief scientist, who happened to be both a SEAL and an astronaut.
Whoa!
Very unique combination, who had been up. And he gave this briefing, and I got him afterwards, and he was talking about the use of lasers and microwaves and whatnot. And I said, what I don't understand is I gave that same briefing 30 years ago, and not a lot has changed. It's always right around the corner and whatnot. And now there's certainly advances in, sensor systems and precision munitions and things of that nature. But I think the transition, a lot of it, civilian technology is moving at a really fast pace, and so I don't see that much. A few of the areas and applications, but I think economics are driving the civilian applications, and where most of the research, quote, government research, is really contracted out.
Well,
It's in the civilian sector and does transition far more quickly than it used to.
Well, I do appreciate you taking the time to talk about Reality Denied and some of the topics that are covered. It's a marvelous book. I can't wait to finish it. I know a lot of guys, when you talk to them in interviews, they go, oh, yeah, I read the book. And they have some assistant that highlights different things throughout the book. But I'm telling you, this is a great book. You can get more information about John B. Alexander at johnbalexander.com. You can also buy his books. He's got other books besides the two that I have in my hands, UFO Myths, Conspiracies, and Realities, Reality Denied. Fantastic. This is such a great read, Colonel. I really look forward to devouring this stuff. And you have various other books that you've published over the years. It must be over 20, I think, right?
Well, there's a number of books, and if they go on the website, if they're interested in monographs from a military perspective, there you can just download them. Oh,
that's fantastic. Well, thank you very much, and hopefully we'll be able to have you back and talk more about this kind of stuff.
Super.
I love it. Thank you.
Great.
Take care. Bye-bye.
All right, thank you.